Thank you for joining us today for our first episode of our podcast, The Path. Today we have the honor to welcome Mr. Peter Sanders. You are amongst the 500 most influential Muslims in the world. You have been a photographer for more than 50 years. You started your career in the 60s photographing iconic musicians from Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, and the Rolling Stones. And at some point decided to leave everything for a spiritual quest. You've been to India for a few months and then to Morocco. So our first question today is why?
Yeah. Anyone that knows the 60s, it was quite fashionable for people to go to India on their spiritual quest. And some people went to Morocco, but I think that was not so much spiritual at that time. It probably was more the drugs or something. They could, another place where they could go and take drugs or something. So I went to India and I just took off with my cameras and went on my quest. I ended up spending 7 months in India traveling around. And I was basically looking for a teacher. And I found a teacher within about a month and ended up staying with him for about 6 months. And I was looking at different religions. I was just, looking at Hinduism and Buddhism and Sikhism, and I also read a little bit about Islam, not a huge amount, but I read enough that I felt I had a bit of an understanding about the religion. And then I came back to the UK, and I've told this story many times before. Some of my friends who I knew before I went to India, some of them had got more into drugs and more into strange things. And then a few of them, some musicians I knew, had become Muslim while I'd been in India. So that was curious for me. And then various things happened over the next couple of months, various dreams and things which indicated that I should look into Islam a bit more. And I had a very interesting conversation with somebody who was a Muslim, an English person. And I said to him, actually he was running a carpet shop, which was quite interesting in Chelsea. And I asked him, can you tell me about Sufism, about Tasawwuf? He explained it in a very nice way for me, in the fact that Tasawwuf or Sufism, whatever you call it, is really about the spiritual practices of Islam. But you couldn't take that aspect of Islam without taking the Sharia, or the outside form of Islam. Like the two were part and parcel of the same thing. If you just took Sufism, it's quite dangerous. The way he described it was like plugging into the mains without any insulation. And the Sharia by itself is very dry, it's just the rules and regulations. So it made really common sense to me. So he said, but at some point you have to enter through the door of Islam. And I said, well, now I'm ready. It was as easy as that. It was really a leap of faith. And I ended up saying the Shahada with him in the carpet shop. And then within, I think, 3 weeks of that, I was on my way to Morocco to meet Sidi Mohammed Ibn Habib, who was from Meknes, who was a great teacher. He was nearly 100 years old, and when I met him, and he was the first person that I photographed. Really, any of the people that know my project, Meetings with Mountains, which is the journey to meet these spiritual beings of Islam, he was the first person that I met, the first person that I photographed. I had met kind of gurus in India, but meeting him was a very different experience.
How come?
People referred to him as Insan al-Kamil, this like the perfect human being. So I didn't know what to expect. And when I went to meet him, he was his room was at the top of a very tall building, very long stairs, and so I was slightly nervous as I went up to meet him. But as soon as I entered into that room, I just felt this tranquility and peace that was very palpable, and it had a very strong effect on me. And yeah, it was a very powerful experience. And one of the first things Sidi Imam Habib said to me was, he said, "Now you have two teachers, Jesus and Muhammad." And the more I think about that, that's such an amazing thing, because he didn't separate me from what I'd come from. He joined it together. I thought that was really beautiful and very, great wisdom in that. And then I ended up spending the whole month of Ramadan with him in his zawiya.
So that was your first experience in a Zawiya, right? How was it?
It was, having been in India, it was tough. It was quite stark. And I remember the first few days, and I started to meet the fuqara. They're quite, how can I say, quite powerful looking, and at first you think they're quite severe. They were extremely poor, a lot of them. But as I got to know them, they had hearts of gold, and I realized they were amazing. That hard exterior just shielded a very beautiful, tender hearts, and I got to know them all. And I photographed them. Many of them are in the book, many of his people and followers. And it was really an eye-opener for me. And I spent the whole month in his zawiya, never leaving for the whole of Ramadan. The first day I left after that was the day of the Eid, and I went out into the gardens in Maknes, and it was beautiful. The sky was blue and the green of the trees, and yeah, it was an amazing day. Yeah.
That's so beautiful. And starting from that, so that was the beginning of your book, Meeting with Mountains, right?
Yes.
Starting from that, you decided to meet other spiritual leaders, spiritual saints around the world. How that, like, it started with this, but then how you decided to go further on the process?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't conscious. It wasn't a conscious thing. I mean, I was a photographer, so I tended to photograph things around me. But he died within a very short time, so he was meant to perform the Hajj that year that I'd met him, and I just remember thinking, well, if he's going to perform Hajj, I want to go and be in Mecca when he's there. And by God's generosity, I was given a ticket, and because I didn't have any money at the time, I was given a ticket, and I went with a group of people. And when we got to Mecca, we got the news that he had died on the way, performing his Hajj. So, my physical relationship was quite short, although I felt a very strong connection with him, and that helped me. But obviously, after a time, I wanted to find another teacher, and that journey really took me on a kind of quest, really. And that's what really developed into the whole project, really. I mean, it didn't start off as an idea I was going to do this book, but it just grew into this thing as my journey continued, yeah.
From what I've read, you've been one of the first Westerners to go to the Hajj and be able to take photos with permission, of course.
Yeah, no, I wasn't the first. There's been a few people before me. Some people impersonated being Muslims to go in there, but I'm one of the first. Yes, and I was given permission to photograph the Hajj in Mecca and Medina. Yes.
And how was it being there?
Well, it's very powerful. I mean, to be honest, as a photographer, I wouldn't recommend doing the Hajj and trying to photograph it. It's a kind of contradiction, because to photograph the Hajj, you need to be everywhere at the same time. And doing the Hajj, you have certain rituals to perform. And so you could end up in out of credit rather than in credit in trying to photograph it as well. But anyway, I did do it that in 71, 72 when I photographed it. And, I'm grateful because that's a very unique time to photograph it. It was still pretty, in fact, I just went to Germany recently to see the first photos ever taken of the Kaaba and Mecca and Medina by an Egyptian photographer called Sadiq Bey. And it's amazing when I looked at those photographs in the 70s when I went, there was very little change actually. They still had the old mimbar, they still had some of the buildings for the different mathabs in the haram. So it was quite similar. I mean, it's only really in the later years all these changes have started happening. So it was a good time to see Mecca and Medina.
Mr. Sanders, so having studied the religions of the East, before you found yourself spending a little more time in Islam, did you find any similarities between, say, Hinduism and Islam or any of the other?
Yeah, you do. And I mean, it's interesting you say that because I'm currently working on a book which is called Heaven, Earth, and the 10,000 Things, The Lives of Muslims in China. And in that book, we're really looking at this fusion or continuation of Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and Islam. You probably know the history, but they were in China very, very early, 60 years after they made Hijrah to Medina. The sons of the Sahaba, it's not really clear whether they were Sahaba or sons of Sahaba, who were actually in China within 60 years. And that's part of my book is documenting all that history and then just showing the culture, how very Chinese the Muslim culture is. And so they didn't become Arabs. They are really Chinese, but they have taken on Islam. And this link with Taoism and Confucianism is really fascinating for me. And that's what we're exploring in the book. And that's what I'm working on. I hope to finish that by next year, inshallah. What we discovered, and I'm working with a young editor who's helping me with the research, but we found out in the Ming dynasty, there were two Muslim scholars. One was the equivalent of Imam al-Ghazali, and the other one was the equivalent of Sheikh Muhyiddin al-Arabi. And the two scholars got together and said, the only way we can teach Islam to the Chinese is if we become Buddhist, Confucian, Taoist monks, which they did. So they studied those religions or thoughts. And then once they'd studied it, they said the only way we can't talk to the Chinese in Arabic because they don't understand Arabic. And so they adopted this language that the Confucian Taoist monks would have used. So instead of talking about God, they talked about the way of the pure or the most real. They didn't talk about prophets, they talked about sages. They didn't talk about Iman about belief, they talked about the clear light in the heart. So this was a language the Chinese could understand. And therefore, Islam wasn't seen as a threat, it was seen as a continuation of what they already knew. And during the Ming dynasty Islam spread quite a lot in China. Even the emperor became a Muslim. So, it's really, for me, that's really interesting as a way of how you present Islam to people that are not familiar with the religion. Or as the Chinese would say, the way, the way of Islam.
Well, there is this hadith saying that Muslims should seek knowledge even in China.
Yeah, I mean, some people say that's a weak hadith, but the sentiment is true. We should look for knowledge everywhere, So it's and there was some wisdom in him saying that. If you think about it, the fact that they went 60 years after Hijrah, they were in China. I mean, how did they make this journey? That's what amazed me. I mean, it's not easy to travel all the way to China.
I would like to have, please, your opinion on something, on how you see Islam and Tasawwuf in general today, as we hear more and more that the renewal of Sufism or Tasawwuf will come from the West.
I think that's an important question to ask, because if you look at what's happening, there is, as you say, in the West, because of materialistic societies, there is an interest in spiritual things. And I think definitely Sufism addresses all those aspects, about working on yourself, realizing that you have some flaws in yourself, and realizing that you have to work on them. I think it's funny you should say it, because I was thinking about that today. I was thinking that each day we are shown our own weaknesses and our own strengths in our day-to-day life. But it's a choice of choosing, well, do you want the fire or do you want the garden? You have to choose your strengths and work on your weaknesses. And that's really a spiritual journey. That's a spiritual journey everybody is on, whether they recognize it or not. I think, some people try and tell themselves, well, I'm in the world and I'll leave all that spirituality till later. But sometimes we don't have that luxury, and we are spiritual beings, whether we accept it or not.
I wanted also to talk about finding a real master. I think it's really hard, especially nowadays, and with the youth generation that want everything really quickly, with social networks, how we live and everything. I think also COVID and, well, the war have an impact on the youth and all generation in general, but more and people are questioning their lives. More and more people are going to yoga classes. They want to know more about spirituality in general, and the whole thing is not to be surrounded by fake gurus or fake sheikh who will harm you more than anything.
It's an important point, and that's what we were trying to address in the exemplars, really, because I became aware that, well, even when I was young, that we look for role models, and maybe some of the role models we take when we're younger, like musicians or footballers or film stars or whatever, they may be good at what they do, but to take them as your role model is maybe not, a role model. Somebody you accept as a role model has to be 100%, or as near as 100%, acceptable as a role model. And so really in exemplars, we were trying to present teachers who lived in the last 150 years are people who could be accepted as role models. And they're all different. That's the point about them. Somebody from Morocco, Imam Nabib, someone from Mauritania, Turkey. There's even a Pakistani man who spent a lot of time in the UK. So we tried to choose very varied people who all had different kind of lives, but they are accepted as kind of role models. And that was really the idea about thinking about that. And the second thing is, they are hard to find, but if your intention is pure and you ask God, God will show you who your teacher or role model is, and that's part of the spiritual journey. Now, there is a lot of there has become issues, and it's not a modern day issue. I mean, we spoke to one of the teachers about this. He's just said, this is an old story about people who put themselves forward as teachers or role models or sheikhs, whatever term you want to use. And actually, people then discover that they weren't as pure as it was made out. But that is still part of your journey. And I always say, if you discover something, then just say salam alaikum and go and look and begin searching again. Yeah. You'll learn something about yourself. And Sheikh Ali al-Jamal from Morocco said, you have to know the false teachers before you know the true teachers. So it's part of your spiritual journey. And don't let it put you off, because this is important. Islam didn't come in a vacuum. It came with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have the book, the Quran, but then we have the human person, because you need to see how a human person embodies that and how they are in the world. So it's very important to see someone, especially living in this time that we are. And as you say, there's a lot of people with mental issues, and particularly at this time, it's a very difficult time for young people. I think the important thing to remember about the true teachers or exemplars is that they do not sit in judgment of you. I mean, we live in a very judgment-orientated society, and people are very critical. But a true teacher doesn't sit there in judgment of you. He sees you at a certain point on your spiritual journey, and if he's very enlightened, he may see that, okay, in the future you may have some difficulties, and he'll pray that those difficulties are lightened or give you advice or whatever. So that's it, but it's not from a position of judgment, and people should always remember that. It's always from a position of compassion, and that is extremely important.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. I wanted to know, so your last book is Meeting with Mountains. Do you have any book coming for the next few months?
I've actually just released another book, which was a shared project called Exemplars for Our Time, which is a 9-part series. It's a kind of continuation of Meetings with Mountains, but I always wanted in Meetings with Mountains to have some biographies of some of the people featured in Meetings with Mountains, and the book became too big, so we shelved this idea. And then a friend of mine, Harun Michael Sugic, was having a similar idea, and so we collaborated together and we did this. So it's basically a box set, 9 different books. One is an introduction, and then the other 8 are people that we chose and wrote their biographies, really, so to tell their story, more of their story. I was the photo editor, so I, organized all the pictures for it. It's quite well illustrated, so it's quite attractive for young people.
Thank you so much again.
No, pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It was really a great honor to meet you both.
Have a good day. Thank you, Mr. Sanders.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.